I think Canada is going to be a very serious contender to be our 51st state.
When I go to the grocery store, I look for the Canadian, the little maple leaf that a lot of grocery stores have put on the shelves to, try and purchase Canadian items or Mexican items, anything other than the United States.
Donald Trump's tariff threats have spawned a growing patriotism in Canada, something reflected in declining trips to the U.S., and new numbers show that, in fact, fewer Canadians are going south to shop or vacation.
Picture this. You walk into a grocery store in Toronto or Vancouver. You see the usual brands: Coke, Oreos, Heinz ketchup, maybe a Tesla parked outside, Amazon boxes on doorsteps. For decades, these weren't just products, they were symbols of American dominance. But something has changed. Quietly, without headlines or hashtags, Canadians began turning away. They stopped filling their carts with US goods. They cancelled subscriptions. They cancelled vacations. They chose maple leaves over golden arches. And the impact? A tidal wave. Billions of dollars vanishing from the American economy almost overnight. Not because of war. Not because of sanctions. But because America's closest friend simply walked away. Even more shocking, this wasn't driven by politicians or protests. It was a silent rebellion. Every shopping cart became a statement. Every receipt a rejection. No banners, no chants, just cold, calculated consumer choices. And here's where it gets dangerous. This isn't happening in China, Russia, or Iran. It's happening in Canada, the neighbor the US has always trusted the most. If America's closest ally can pull the plug on its brands, the real question is terrifying. Who's next? Stay with us, because what started as a trade spat is now threatening to unravel America's corporate empire, from McDonald's and Amazon to Tesla and Netflix. And the collapse is happening faster than anyone thought possible. It didn't begin with protests in the streets. There were no fiery speeches, no massive rallies. Instead, it began in the most ordinary place imaginable, the grocery store. For decades, Canadians filled their shopping carts with American products without thinking twice. Coca-Cola, Oreos, Heinz ketchup, Levi's jeans, Nike sneakers, and on every corner, a McDonald's golden arch glowing like a familiar friend. It wasn't just shopping, it was part of life. But in early 2025, that routine suddenly changed. A quiet shift swept across the country. Polls showed that 59% of Canadians were now deliberately avoiding American brands. Think about that. More than half the population, united not by chants or slogans, but by silent choices at the checkout line. Instead of Oreos, they picked up Canadian cookies. Instead of McDonald's fries made from Idaho potatoes, they turned to local diners serving homegrown alternatives. Instead of clicking, buy now on Amazon, they started seeking Canadian marketplaces and apps designed to highlight local sellers. No protests. No drama. Just wallets closing. And the numbers hit like a punch. Over $2 billion vanished from the US economy almost overnight. Not because of government sanctions. Not because of global crises. But because ordinary Canadians, moms, students, truck drivers, families, decided quietly to say no. This was no coincidence. Every receipt became a symbol of resistance. Every cancelled subscription was a small act of defiance. And every empty McDonald's order, every unopened Amazon package, was another sign that trust in American companies had cracked. The scariest part? There was no single leader organizing it. No political party directing it. This was grassroots in the truest sense. Millions of private, individual decisions stacking up into something powerful enough to rattle the world's largest economy. And while Canadian politicians reacted with tariffs and countermeasures, the people themselves went further. They didn't just retaliate. They unplugged .by March. Analysts were stunned. They called it a quiet consumer rebellion. But for the US, it was more than rebellion. It was a warning shot. Because when even your closest ally starts turning its back without making noise, the question isn't why it's happening. The real question is, what happens next? To understand why this consumer revolt exploded, we have to rewind to a single announcement in Washington, D.C. on February 1st, 2025. President Donald Trump stood before reporters and declared a new wave of tariffs. 25% duties on Canadian steel and aluminum. For many Americans, it sounded like just another chapter in Trump's long history of tough trade talk. But in Canada, it landed like a thunderclap. Steel and aluminum aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They're the backbone of industries, jobs, and communities. From Hamilton steel plants in Ontario to aluminum smelters in Quebec, families depend on those exports. And when the White House moved to choke them, Canadians felt it not as policy, but as an attack on their livelihood. Then, only weeks later, Trump escalated again. This time, it wasn't just steel and aluminum, it was autos and consumer goods. Suddenly, entire sectors of the Canadian economy were staring down the barrel of US tariffs. Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't hesitate. He struck back with counter-tariffs on American products, targeted export bans, and perhaps most importantly, a clear political message. Canada will not be bullied. But here's the twist. Canadians didn't just sit back and watch politicians trade blows. They joined the fight, using the most powerful weapon they had, their wallets. Trips across the border? Cancelled. Disney World vacations? Abandoned. Online subscriptions to US platforms? Dropped overnight. And in stores, shoppers began demanding clearer labels. Apps and grocery chains started marking which items were made in USA, so Canadians could avoid them entirely. This was no longer just about tariffs. It was personal. McDonald's, Amazon, Tesla, Coca-Cola. These weren't just companies anymore. They became symbols of America's heavy hand. And Canadians made a collective decision. We don't need you. By April, the numbers were undeniable. US exports to Canada were falling, Canadian countermeasures were biting back, and American corporations that once dominated the Canadian market were suddenly scrambling. But the first sector to truly feel the heat wasn't steel, or autos, or even groceries. It was something much more fragile, and much more visible: tourism. For decades, American tourism could always count on one reliable group of visitors: Canadians. Every winter, tens of thousands packed their bags for Florida beaches. Families drove across the border for weekend shopping trips in Buffalo or Detroit. Retirees booked Vegas casinos. Students rushed to New York concerts. Canadians weren't just visitors. They were a lifeline for countless US towns and cities. But in 2025, that lifeline was cut. Almost overnight, border crossings fell silent. The numbers tell a chilling story. Cross-border car traffic dropped 23%, and flight bookings for the summer collapsed by over 70% compared to 2024. That's not a slowdown. That's a freefall. Hotels that once buzzed with Canadian accents suddenly sat half empty. Restaurant owners in upstate New York reported weekend sales plunging. Taxi drivers in Las Vegas complained of fewer airport pickups. Even airlines admitted on earnings calls that their summer projections had fallen off a cliff. And here's what makes it worse. This wasn't a temporary dip. It was deliberate. Canadians weren't traveling less overall. They were still spending on vacations, but they chose anywhere except America. Mexico saw a spike. Europe welcomed more Canadian tourists. Domestic travel within Canada boomed. But US destinations? They were being ghosted. The US Travel Association sounded the alarm. They warned that just a 10% drop in Canadian visitors could erase $2.1 billion and 14,000 American jobs. Yet what they faced wasn't a 10% dip. It was a collapse that threatened entire regions. In cities like Las Vegas and New York, the impact was immediate. Fewer hotel bookings, emptier malls, thinner crowds at attractions. But in small border towns, the fallout was devastating. Gas stations, outlet malls, local diners, all built on the back of Canadian weekend shoppers, now stood eerily quiet. And for many business owners, the silence felt like betrayal. Canada wasn't supposed to be the enemy. For generations, they had been family. Yet now, that family had closed their wallets and turned away. The message was clear. If you attack us with tariffs, we'll hit you where it hurts most, your economy. And this was just the beginning. Because while fewer Canadian tourists spelled trouble for hotels and casinos, the boycott was about to strike at something even bigger. The very supply chains that kept American brands alive. When the boycott spread from tourism to trade, the real panic began. In early March 2025, Canadian regulators took a step no one thought possible. They pulled US liquor off store shelves. Overnight, American whiskey and spirits, products that once dominated Canadian bars and parties, vanished. The result? A 66% collapse in sales in just weeks. For US exporters, this was worse than any tariff. It wasn't just a tax on their goods, it was erasure. If your bottle doesn't even make it to the shelf, you can't compete. You can't sell. You're invisible. And the shockwaves rippled instantly across the border. Bars in Vancouver, liquor stores in Toronto, restaurants in Montreal, all reworked their menus and stocked Canadian alternatives. Suddenly, loyalty to Jack Daniels or Jim Beam wasn't just shaken, it was broken. But liquor was only the beginning. By April, McDonald's Canada, the Golden Arches themselves, reported one of its worst quarters since 2020. For decades, McDonald's was untouchable in Canada. Yet now, customers weren't abandoning fast food. They were abandoning American fast food. And quietly, franchises cut their orders from US suppliers. That decision set off a domino effect. Potato farms in Idaho noticed fewer shipments crossing the border. Packaging plants in Missouri canceled shifts. Truck drivers who once carried frozen goods north found their routes shrinking. One McDonald's manager admitted foot traffic hadn't even dropped that much. But people were changing what they ordered. Fewer Coke refills, fewer fries, fewer US-branded menu items. Every skipped order was another pinprick in the supply chain. And behind the scenes, technology accelerated the collapse. Canadians began downloading Buy Canadian apps. Simple tools that scanned barcodes and told shoppers whether a product was American-made. In seconds, consumers could see where their groceries came from, and if it was US-produced, many simply put it back on the shelf. This wasn't noisy. It wasn't violent. It was quiet, methodical, and devastating. Factories in the Midwest, warehouses along the border, and transport companies suddenly faced empty order books. The boycott wasn't about yelling in the streets. It was about cash registers going silent and supply lines drying up. And that's when US corporations realized this wasn't a passing storm. The rebellion was reaching their doorstep. The next stage wasn't about spirits or potatoes. It was about giants, the companies America thought could never fall. And yet, in Canada, even the titans of the global economy were suddenly under siege. For decades, America's corporate giants walked across the Canadian market like kings. Amazon promised fast delivery. Tesla sold the future of cars. Heinz ketchup sat on nearly every dinner table. These brands weren't just products, they were cultural staples. But in 2025, even the giants began to fall. It started with Amazon. For millions of Canadians, Amazon Prime was a daily habit. But that trust cracked almost overnight. Rising anti-American sentiment collided with worker disputes, and in late January, Amazon made a stunning announcement. It would shut down all 7 of its warehouses in Quebec, eliminating nearly 2,000 jobs. The fallout was immediate. Prime delivery times doubled. Customers who once received packages in 2 days were now waiting a week or more. Frustration boiled over. A survey revealed that 41% of Canadians planned to stop or reduce Amazon use entirely. What was once a symbol of speed and convenience became a symbol of American overreach, and Canadians were happy to let it collapse. Next came Tesla. In the United States, Tesla is an icon of innovation. But in Canada, it turned into a lightning rod. A poll in April 2025 revealed that 71% of Canadians supported a moratorium on Tesla sales. Think about that. 7 out of 10 people were ready to slam the door on Elon Musk's empire. Cybertruck orders in Ontario and Quebec collapsed. Dealerships faced waves of cancellations. And behind it all was a growing perception. Tesla wasn't just an American car, it was an American statement. And in the climate of 2025, that made it toxic. Then came a symbol even more powerful than Amazon or Tesla: Heinz ketchup. For generations, Heinz was as Canadian as hockey. Every restaurant table had a red bottle of it. But the loyalty cracked years earlier, when Heinz shut down its Ontario plant, cutting local jobs and moving production elsewhere. That decision came back to haunt them in 2025. Faced with the boycott, Canadians didn't hesitate. They reached for French's ketchup instead, proudly advertised as locally made. Supermarkets put up banners urging customers to buy Canadian. And in a matter of months, Heinz, a company that once owned the condiment aisle, was dethroned in its second largest market. One by one, the titans stumbled. Amazon warehouses empty. Tesla orders vanish. Heinz bottles gather dust. And the message spread far beyond ketchup, cars, or online shopping. It wasn't just about rejecting American products anymore. It was about dismantling America's cultural grip. Because the next stage of the boycott wasn't about commerce. It was about identity, music, fashion, entertainment, streaming. Things America had exported to the world for decades. And in 2025, even those cultural pillars began to collapse. For decades, America's cultural exports weren't just products. They were symbols of identity. A Coke wasn't just a drink, it was Americana in a bottle. Nike sneakers weren't just shoes, they were status. Netflix wasn't just TV, it was the future of entertainment. But in 2025, Canadians began asking a dangerous question. Why should we keep paying for someone else's story? The cracks showed everywhere. IT started in the aisles of grocery stores. US beverage shipments, orange juice, sodas, citrus fruit, were quietly halted. Canadian retailers stopped restocking American brands. Shoppers noticed gaps on shelves where Coke or Minute Maid used to sit, now filled with local alternatives. Then came Oreos. A small detail sparked outrage. Canadians realized their beloved Oreo packages now carried a Made in Mexico label. To many, it felt like betrayal. First, outsourcing jobs away from North America, and now, during a boycott, asking Canadians to keep buying foreign-made cookies? Media outlets amplified the anger, and suddenly, Oreos became a symbol of disloyalty. Streaming services, America's soft power juggernaut, didn't escape either. Netflix, Disney+, and X were already under fire for price hikes and password crackdowns. But during the boycott, those frustrations turned into rebellion. Canadians flooded forums with cancellation screenshots, proudly announcing they were walking away. What had once been entertainment was now a political choice. And then came Nike. For years, Nike dominated Canada's youth culture. Sneakers on every street corner, swooshes on every hoodie. But in 2025, student groups and youth organizations in Quebec and Ontario launched campaigns against Nike, highlighting reports of unethical labor practices abroad. Suddenly, teenagers who once saved up for Jordans were posting photos of themselves wearing Canadian-made shoes and clothes, even if they cost more. Buying local became cool. Supporting American brands became something to avoid. What made this cultural collapse so dangerous was its subtlety. Nobody was burning flags. Nobody was smashing TVs. Instead, Canadians were voting with their dollars. And the vote was clear. America's cultural dominance was no longer welcome. The fallout spread beyond shelves and subscriptions. Retailers began rethinking their sourcing. Streaming companies saw subscriptions plummet. Youth fashion scenes shifted overnight. One Canadian journalist summed it up perfectly. The shopping cart has become a statement. And here's the chilling part. These weren't small losses. They were symbols unraveling. Oreo, Coke, Nike, Netflix, icons of American influence that once felt untouchable, were now being rejected by Canada, the very neighbor that had embraced them the longest. IT wasn't just about brands anymore. It was about trust. And trust, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild. And that raised the scariest question of all. If Canada, America's closest ally, could turn its back on US culture, what would stop Europe, Asia, or Latin America from doing the same? By the time spring of 2025 rolled around, it was no longer just about tariffs, cancelled vacations, or empty shelves. Something deeper had shifted. What collapsed in Canada wasn't just consumer spending. It was trust. For decades, American brands weren't simply products. They were cultural anchors. Drinking a Coke was like drinking a piece of the American dream. Wearing Nike sneakers meant joining a global tribe built on sports, music, and culture. A Netflix subscription wasn't just entertainment. It was access to the world's most powerful storytelling machine. But now, Canadians weren't seeing pride in those brands. They were seeing politics, greed, and betrayal. A Coke wasn't refreshment anymore. It was a reminder of trade wars. An Oreo wasn't comfort. It was an outsourced factory job. A Tesla wasn't innovation. It was a symbol of American arrogance. Netflix wasn't convenience. It was corporate control. One by one, the pillars of America's soft power cracked. And when trust evaporates, no advertising budget, no discount, no PR spin can bring it back quickly. This was the real danger. Canada wasn't America's enemy. It was its closest ally, its most reliable friend, its family across the border. If even Canada could lose faith, what did that signal to the rest of the world? Global markets were watching closely. European commentators asked, if Canadians can live without Amazon, why can't we? Asian analysts wondered, if Tesla can be boycotted in Toronto, what happens in Tokyo? Latin American leaders quietly began talking about diversifying away from US platforms and products. The US had always assumed that its dominance was permanent, that its brands were too big to fail, too loved to abandon. But in 2025, Canada proved otherwise. Because here's the truth. Tariffs may have been the spark, but consumer behavior became the wildfire. And wildfires don't stop at borders. What happened in Canada wasn't just about ketchup or sneakers or vacations. It was about rewriting the rules of loyalty in a globalized world. Trust, not tariffs, was now the deciding factor in who leads and who follows. And that's what terrified Washington, Wall Street, and American CEOs the most. Because if Canada, the neighbor that knows America best, could turn its back so quickly, then the question isn't whether this rebellion spreads. The question is, where does it spread first? What started as a small trade dispute has spiraled into something far greater than tariffs, steel, or aluminum. It became a quiet rebellion, fought not with armies or protests, but with shopping carts, receipts, and cancelled trips that end just a few months. Canada proved something that should terrify every American CEO and politician. Brand power is not permanent. McDonald's, Amazon, Tesla, Heinz, Netflix, Nike, names that once seemed untouchable, suddenly looked fragile. Not because the products failed, but because the trust behind them cracked. And when trust breaks, even the mightiest brands collapse like glass. Billions of dollars have already been wiped away. Supply chains are rattled. Tourism has dried up. Cultural icons are losing their grip. And here's the haunting truth. This isn't happening in Beijing, Moscow, or Tehran. It's happening in Canada, America's best friend. If Canada can unplug so easily, what stops Europe from doing the same? What about Asia, where US brands already face competition from homegrown giants? What about Latin America, Africa, the Middle East? For the first time in generations, America's soft power, the quiet dominance of its products, its culture, its influence, is showing cracks. And cracks spread. Because tariffs can be repealed, sanctions can be lifted, policies can change. But when trust is gone, it may never return. So here's the real question. Is this just a temporary flare-up, or is it the beginning of the end of American brand supremacy worldwide? The answer may determine not just the future of American corporations, but the balance of global power itself. And what about you? Do you believe Canada's boycott is just a moment of anger, or the first domino in a global reset where America's dominance finally fades? Let us know in the comments, because this story is far from over.